in an increasingly digital world, how do we keep the tactile magic of hands-on STEM learning alive? Today, we're joined by Alex Moore from STEM Learning to explore how unplugged STEM activities can help strike the perfect balance between screens and hands-on experimentation. Welcome to this mini podcast leading up to the STEM Learning Conference in Dubai. I'm your host, Alex Gray, and today we are exploring the role of hands-on STEM in a digital age. Alex, welcome to the International Classroom Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Just coming fresh off the back of a day of teaching.
So whereabouts in the world do we find you?
So I'm based in Dorset, which is in the south coast of England, about 2 hours from London.
Amazing. And how would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners today?
Okay, so my name's Alex Moore, as Alex said, and I am assistant head teacher 2 days a week at Shaftesbury School in Dorset. And then I consult for STEM learning, working with the education team, looking at AI and how we can integrate really great STEM programs for CPD across the country and beyond.
I think for most educators with a science background or some engineering or STEM based around the world know of it. And it's known for innovative CPD. So how do you ensure hands-on tactile activities remain a key component in these initiatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's about two things, really. It's about balance and it's about creativity. So the balance with, particularly in a science context, it's about having the practical lessons when they're needed, but also being able to stand back and do the notes and the more formative part of the curriculum when required as well. So it's about having a really healthy balance. And as we're sort of working in a world where I guess we're surrounded by wicked problems, interdisciplinary thinking across the four acronyms, STEM, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, is becoming more prevalent in today's world. And certainly the children we teach are asking for more practical activities, but it's having that balance between what needs to be done practically and what can be done in other ways. And obviously we have technology as well, which disrupts the traditional practical element of subjects like science and computing. And it's hands-on, but also it's how can we be hands-on using technology, but make all of those things useful for the learning.
Now, you mentioned something in there that I've heard a few times for speaking to different people around the world. You mentioned wicked problems, and some people listening today and watching today may not have heard of that. Could you just explain for us what a wicked problem is and then how it fits into this design thinking process as well?
Yeah, of course. So wicked problems are really complex problems that are kind of a web, like a network of not easy to solve variables. So they have no clear endpoint. So climate change is a great example. Another wicked problem to an extent would be COVID-19, because we're still grappling with kind of the fallout of that. And these problems are really difficult to solve. They don't have a quick fix, and they often require a multitude of different approaches. And I often use COVID as an example with my students, sort of saying, well, what was the first thing that happened when COVID broke out? It was about communication, which is that English skill, that language skill. Then it was about geography and where the sort of breakout infection rates were across the world. Then it was about mathematics, so analyzing the data of infection rates. And then the science came like further down the line when we started to get vaccines. So it's kind of a wicked problem. It requires an interdisciplinary approach to sort of break down to constituent parts, and they often overlap and kind of collide. And that's where STEM fits beautifully into that future sort of problem solving and what our children will need to do to have agency in that future.
Amazing. Thank you. That's a fantastic, simplistically put description of it as well, which is really, really useful. So thinking about, obviously, you've mentioned some activities and initiatives that you've used yourself. Can you share with us some examples specifically of unplugged learning activities that educators that you've worked with have found particularly impactful?
Yeah, definitely. So probably the most useful thing was to break it down to a few subject examples at primary and secondary, just to really give context to the listeners. So at STEM Learning, we use a product called Explorify, which is a fantastic way to get children to be really hands-on with the learning. It requires them to use critical thinking, creativity. It requires them to actually do things with the product. So they're physically using their hands. It's quite a tactile experience. At primary science, for example, that is a really powerful way to ignite that imagination and get them to make real world connections between the science, which in some circumstances could be quite abstract concepts to them, to the real world applications. Oh, I can do it like this. I can relate it to that. And it can be quite messy at times as well. So it kind of leans on that play element, which is really fundamental at primary science. In computing, it's slightly different. So I'm a computing teacher. I teach year 7, which in the UK, the kids are aged 11. And I teach all the way up to sort of year 10. So they're about 15, 16. And we try and walk the balance between the physical computing, so the elements that the children can do with their hands, the tactile bits. So, for example, can they construct a machine? Can they take it apart using screwdrivers and whatnot? But also in computing, we have this beautiful field of robotics, right, which is kind of parallels with AI. And how can we teach the kids to code a robot and to move it around a space and to solve problems? And the children really, really enjoy that. And some of the pioneering work that I've seen in this field in the UK recently has been around flying drones. So getting children to potentially, they are a medical team and they have to get a drone through a navigation course. So they have to kind of write the course, they have to script it, they have to look at the problem, then they have to write a set of variables and controls to move it through. We've done the same with electric cars using block code. So the kids will code the movements for an EV car, and then they will physically build the robotics kit, and then they'll race their EV car against the rest of their friends whilst learning about sort of sustainable infrastructures and how electric cars are better for the environment than potentially petrol or diesel. And the same could be done for sort of hydrogen models. So it's really interesting kind of taking that real world application and bringing it into the classroom. Mathematics is an interesting one, and I wasn't quite sure about this, so I had to ask an expert within the team, Michael, who's going to be speaking at the conference, and he was talking about manipulatives. So this idea that in maths, manipulatives and representation are an aid that they can use. And he was talking about the concrete feel of manipulatives, so it's tactile, and that initial interacting with the mathematics enables the student then to have a really good conceptual understanding. And he was saying the next form is that we then take that to pictorial. So once they've had hands-on with it, whether that's an AR product, augmented reality, or a VR, or something quite physical, they can then move to the pictorial, the graphic representation. And that then kind of permeates down to the kind of algebraic and in the books, like getting the notes into the books. So I love that kind of breakdown of like the 3 areas to make mathematics more tactile and more accessible to people. So hopefully that's useful.
Definitely. It's me. And you mentioned some interesting things in there as well, because it's a blend of what is going to be digital and technology based versus the tactile hands-on. And obviously with STEM or STEAM or STREAM or whatever whatever it is that we use around the world, and we're seeing an increase in digital platforms being used here. However, those unplugged methods that you've just mentioned, do you think that sometimes then the unplugged methods, the hands-on methods, allow students to get a better understanding of these challenging concepts that we're wanting to teach, and they outperform digital solutions sometimes?
Yeah, I think there's no substitute sometimes for just getting messy and doing the science physically. So take a dissection for experience. We all remember the first time we did a dissection in class. It's probably etched into our memories. You can do that via Meta and like VR devices. So you can do a dissection in virtual reality. Does it feel the same? Do you get the same senses? You get some of them. And actually, you might argue that in a virtual lab, you could potentially learn more in terms of like the keywords that are there in the vista. But the experience of kind of doing something like a dissection is going to be pretty memorable, and the learning is likely to probably stick a bit better. So I think it really depends on the context. And I think a lot of teachers, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same where you are starting to use virtual tools to almost overlay the physical to reinforce the learning. So they might use an augmented reality digital twin. They might buzz something into the room and interact with it. And it's such a powerful medium for teaching and reinforcing learning. But equally, there's no point just doing it for the sake of doing it. It's like any good teaching, really. We shouldn't be doing these things just for the sake of it. There has to be a real world purpose behind it.
Yeah, I've seen it before, like with surgeons, you kind of mentioned dissections, or, you can practice and the repetition there in terms of running drills in an augmented or virtual reality is fantastic. But there's no substitute sometimes, especially from a child's experience. We talk about experiential learning, actually that type of thing, and the memory of it, and how it felt and how it smelled, especially with the heart dissection, how it smells sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's just one of them. Are there any things out there that you would also say really are irreplaceable from that actually it has to be hands-on?
Yeah, there's probably a bunch of stuff. I mean, you put me on the spot there a little bit, but let me have a think. I'm just thinking of my own experience as a student, and I'm obviously my background is more sort of biology, physics, and I would say from the physics point of view. So when we do momentum and we do sort of speed and velocity, the racing cars is a fantastic lesson the kids get a lot from, and the learning's really rich there. Now, if I was to try and do that virtually, wouldn't be as successful as I was tried to do that through books or PowerPoints. Wouldn't work. The kids physically need to pick up the different size cars, look at how much they weigh them, add stuff to them, take stuff away, create different gradients, look at different ways to make them accelerate. And we also do a lesson with sprinting where they actually look at Usain Bolt and they watch him run 9.59 over 100 meters, which is really impressive. And then we break down the 10-meter periods and work out how quick he is over each of the 10 meters. Then we go out on the field and we run that. And they work in teams and they have people with stopwatches at every 10 meters. They bring the data back. So we've got the mathematics and the science kind of colliding. And they're out of breath. They're physically engaged in the science, and then they're bringing that science to life via graphs, and they're plotting theirs against Usain's and other famous people, and they're trying to work out who are the quickest and why are they the quickest. Is it because of they're tall or they got short stride length? So the learning there is really rich, and I don't think with those examples you could replicate that in a virtual or kind of textbook way. You just got to get out there and do it.
And how do you see that, and how do you think it's also perceived in terms of student engagement? So we're thinking about, obviously digital is one thing, but when you've got something like that, do you think it then tilts the balance really when it comes to how students are engaged in the learning?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of critical thinking, which is really key at the moment with sort of the noise around digital literacy and what our kids are going to need to do in the future. So there's the problem solving, critical thinking element, but also there's teamwork, which often is difficult to replicate in a classroom environment, because when they go out, for example, and collect, you need 9 people in a team, 10 people in the team, 1 runner, 9 stopwatches. So they need to work together, otherwise they're not going to collect the data. So there's kind of collaboration that's creeping into that as well. So I think it's really, really important that we give kids as many experiences as the curriculum will allow us to do, and that fits with the learning, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes in a 1 hour lesson, just to kind of change the texture of the lesson for a while.
Fantastic. And as we wrap this up then, if there was one piece of advice you could offer to educators out there who are listening and watching this about getting more hands-on, like what would it be? How could they go about making these lessons more hands-on and driving then this engagement and learning that we've talked about, whether it's in a STEM subject or even in different subjects?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think oracy is gathering momentum in the UK at the moment for good reason. So our current government are really pro-oracy. So oracy, for those listening that don't know, is the act of using the voice in the classroom. It's different to student voice. It's using it to enable learning rather than to kind of have an agency. So we're really pushing this at my school, and across the country we're seeing a huge rise in oracy, and it's getting them to speak like a scientist, to use scientific language like hypothesis and variables, and it's getting them to have an agency through their voice within the classroom. And you can do that to really enrich the learning. So for example, if you do a physical experiment where you blow something up or you create something cool in the science lab, it's having that really rich debate about, well, why did we do that? What was the reason that we did that for, and what did we learn from it? And now what we're going to do is we're going to need to get some stuff in books. So we're going to use these sentence starters, and how are we going to finish these sentences, and what's next? So I think oracy is something, when we were chatting about interdisciplinary learning before, I think an oracy is something that touches the boundaries of all subjects really beautifully, because it kind of overlaps, and it's just getting the kids to have a bit more agency. Because in the UK, post-COVID, classrooms have become a little bit more stagnated because of the sanitation measures, and it's become a bit of a default position. So I'm a real advocate for getting kids out of their seats when there's an opportunity, and perhaps they could present, so they could work on a problem within science or within a computing lesson or a physics lesson, and then present the findings back, or almost like in a pitch, like you do in industry where you get up and you pitch. That's really powerful, but they do that through the vehicle of oracy. So I think that's a really exciting way. And just going back to that, having that balance and creativity, there's a real emphasis now on, you mentioned STEAM before, art, science, technology, engineering, art and maths. So that was really interesting you mentioned that, because in the UK, again, the government that are currently in power here are really pushing that creativity back into the curriculum because it's been kind of marginalized a little bit. So the sciences are coming back alongside with things like the creative arts. And it's like, well, how do we find place for that in the classroom? And primary science, I've got an example here from Sarah, who'll be talking at the conference. And she says in year 5, students explore material properties and changes by mixing vinegar and bicarbonate of soda in a bottle, topped with a balloon. This experiment visually demonstrates gas formation, making the learning impact form memorable, but they also investigate variables. So that's that kind of interdisciplinary bit. There's a bit of maths kind of creeping in there as well, which is really good.
That's amazing. A great piece of advice. So thank you ever so much for those insights, Alex. And for those of you attending the STEM Learning Conference in Dubai, don't miss the hands-on workshops to bring these ideas to life.